He asked for one phone call. 5 minutes later, Air Force One carved a white wound through the clouds above DC, and every clock in the precinct seemed to hold its breath. I was supposed to process Gabriel Pike, another midnight arrest with a story too sharp to touch, but his eyes said countdown, not plea. The rain tapped Morse against the barred window as he dialed a number that didn't ring. Somewhere, a circuit awakened, and turbine thunder answered where words did not. Sirens bent around the block. Captain Delgado muttered a prayer with teeth. Agent Mercer arrived without knocking, led by wind and authority, while the Attorney General's name crawled across my phone like a warning. Pike whispered that law without sunlight becomes a weapon, and he had brought a match. I watched the city tilt toward him, toward whatever he detonated with that call, and realized the difference between a defendant and a witness is sometimes just who's allowed to finish their sentence. Outside, landing lights turned the storm into day, and the truth began to taxi. The precinct swelled with arrivals who wore authority like weatherproof skin, and I learned the trick to survival was looking busy while listening harder. Mercer introduced himself with a voice tuned to calm a stampede, asking for the detainee, as if we were returning a misplaced coat, while Delgado pressed back with the polite ferocity of jurisdiction. Gabriel said nothing. The kind of silence that isn't absence but strategy. And in that quiet, I heard the echo of his promised law, without sunlight becomes a weapon. The phone screamed, televisions erupted in special reports, and someone whispered that the president had diverted to the city for an unscheduled security review. Which is how power says I'm coming for the truth. I saw Cade's name flood the call log, and the room chilled. Mercer's eyes found mine and asked a question he didn't speak. Are you going to help me keep this honest? Or help everyone pretend? They moved Gabriel to interview 2. The one with the camera that only worked when it endangered the powerless. I followed with a stack of forms that meant nothing and everything, my badge lifting like a shield in a parade of larger shields. Mercer requested counsel present. Cade's liaison barked that counsel would obstruct. Delgado said we still live in a city with rules. In the cramped room, Gabriel asked for water, and when I set it down, whispered that a directive with no letterhead was being used to squeeze federal judges through debts that were manufactured and then forgiven by friends of the friends. State. He said the key to proving it was splintered. One shard with me, another in a server, under a war memorial. A final with someone who would only show their face if the plane landed. I asked who he'd call. He smiled without warmth and said, the only person who understands that justice without witnesses is just theater. The building's bones groaned as motorcades accumulated outside, and the precinct transformed into a bargaining table with too many hands. Lena Cho slipped past the barricade behind a municipal inspector and aimed her questions like a scalpel, while Cade finally arrived. Charm lacquered over impatience, offering friendship to every camera and pressure to every spot. He declared federal custody. Delgado declared DC ground. Mercer requested a sealed transfer on security grounds. I said my client wasn't going anywhere without representation and a record. The air thickened with the kind of civility that bruises, and somewhere between a nod and a smile I understood that the fight wasn't for Gabriel's body, but for his story. Outside, the storm shifted, and the lights flickered. When they steadied, Cade's eyes were already on me, measuring the shortest path to silence. Word spread that the South Lawn was live and waiting, and that was somehow more terrifying than sirens. Mercer asked quietly whether I had any reason to believe my client's claims, and I surprised both of us by saying I had better reasons to believe my instincts. Gabriel then spoke, not to me, but to the camera in the corner, naming a file path that sounded like a prayer and a threat. He said, the shard I carried wasn't digital at all, but testimony, and that if this night went the way nights usually go, I should remember the last sentence I'd heard him start. The door opened as if on cue, and 2 uniforms reached for him. Mercer raised a hand. Cade smiled. Delgado held the line. From the hallway came a gust of rain-cold air carrying jet fuel and cut grass, and in it I heard everything converging the plane. The power, the promise that someone, finally, had to choose the law instead of its shadow. They carved a corridor through the chaos that felt less like an escort and more like a test who among us would blink first when power stared back. Mercer murmured. Logistics that sounded like lullabies for wolves. Sealed transport, limited personnel, a route that avoided the press. And Delgado matched him with municipal stubbornness, insisting on body cams and assigned custody. Log? Cade drifted between us like a silk curtain concealing a locked door, asking me, all honey, whether my client might prefer federal comfort to city concrete. Gabriel stayed silent until the elevator dinged, then said the record's live where no judge thinks to look in the debts, erased by friends who never appear on paper. The words hung there, heavy and true, and I felt the shard he'd given me harden into obligation. Outside, the storm thinned to needle rain. A call came through that the president was en route to the precinct itself, not the South Lawn, and even Cade's smile struggled. The doors opened, and the floor we stepped onto was made of choices. The motorcade arrived in pieces first. Sirens without cars, radios without voices. Then the black SUVs poured in, and the garage felt suddenly too small for truth. Mercer stepped into a new posture, the kind you wear when your oath is being watched by someone who's signed your paycheck and your conscience, and briefed a woman with an earpiece that wore authority like a second spine. Delgado bristled but moved. Cade produced forms that notarized surrender disguised as cooperation. I read nothing and remembered everything, particularly the part where Gabriel said testimony is a shard that cuts even when hidden. He leaned toward me just enough to fold a sentence into my pocket if the server goes dark. A backup wakes in a place that smells like gun oil and marble. Lena's text lit my phone. She had traced a shell nonprofit to a judge with a forgiven mortgage, and the pattern clicked like tumblers. Above us, tires crackled in the rain. Somewhere close, a helicopter's rotor began to count down the seconds we had left to tell the truth before it was packaged. The president's arrival did not silence the room so much as recalibrate it. Words lowered, eyes sharpened, and even the rain seemed to fall with intention. Eleanor Hart moved through the garage without entourage melodrama, collecting the temperature like a barometer in motion, and stopped where Gabriel could meet her gaze. Mercer introduced. Delgado affirmed. Cade congratulated the process he was already undermining. Hart listened, and in that patience lived a violence of its own. The kind that breaks, lies without raising a hand. Gabriel told her he had served the system until the system served something else, that a signature without a letterhead had become a lever to pry open the Republic and sell the hinges, and that his call had triggered a dead man. Relay set to spill into the city if he vanished. She asked what he needed, he said. Light and a witness who cannot be discredited. Hart looked to me, not Cade, and said, then we start with a record. The camera teams were repositioned. The microphones woke. And for once the script did not belong to the most powerful man in the room, because there wasn't one. We began the record in a maintenance office repurposed into a confessional with bad acoustics and a better conscience. A single camera blinked red. A hand-lettered sign read, evidence in, do not move, which felt like prayer. Hart opened with the civic preamble they don't teach anymore. That power exists to guard rights, not comfort, and then asked me to frame the questions. Cade objected like a metronome. Delgado kept time with statute numbers. Mercer filtered the doorway for anything that wore sabotage. Gabriel spoke names without flourish. Numbers like coordinates, and the outline of the directive emerged, a private ledger of vulnerability, traded as currency. Debts. Manufactured by cutouts, absolutions timed to votes. He gave one path a server farm masked as an archival annex beneath a war memorial, where the key pairs lived like lit fuses. Hart did not flinch. She asked if the backup existed. Gabriel said, if we do this right, we won't need it. If we don't, the city will drown in it. Someone knocked. A signal or an interruption, and the air decided which. The interruption was a courier with credentials too new to be real, carrying an envelope too thin to be safe. Mercer took it, scanned it, and chose the rarest tool in rooms like this: refusal. He ordered a split team, one with Hart, one with Gabriel and me, headed toward the memorial through a service tunnel that smelled of oil and history. Cade insisted on accompanying. Hart nodded as if indulging a guest who will be asked to leave mid-meal. Lena's message landed like a flare. The forgiven mortgage was signed off by a charity board, chaired by a judge who would be on tomorrow's docket. The pattern wasn't a theory anymore. It was a map. In the tunnel, our footsteps learned each other's rhythms. Gabriel told me what the file would show: a permission slip masquerading as necessity, a list of debts that never existed, a chorus of signatures that sang in unison only when the cameras were off. I asked him why me. He said, because you don't want to be right. You want to be honest. Ahead, a metal door waited, and behind it, the machine that thought it was invisible. The steel door yielded with a protest like an oath breaking, and the air beyond was colder, drier, engineered to keep memory from rusting. We stepped into an archival annex that pretended to be paper but hummed with concealed electricity. Tiny tree. Like sorption in a master power core. Electricity. Ranks of gray cabinets marched past plaques about sacrifice, and the irony made the fluorescence flicker harder. Mercer split the team along sightlines. Delgado logged times in block capitals, and Hart's presence steadied the room the way a lighthouse steadies a storm. Gabriel guided me by breadcrumb numbers toward a cage that wasn't on any public map, whispering that the directive's ghost lived behind a memorial that taught school children to say, "Thank you." Cade rehearsed concern into the camera, offering process like a placebo, but his eyes searched for the kill switch. I felt the shard of testimony grow hot. This wasn't just evidence, it was a mirror, angled at every compromise we'd filed under necessary. The cage door clanked, and somewhere, a relay awoke. Red diodes, blooming like alarm. Pupils. Pupils. Inside the cage, the masquerade fell away. Archival labels hid hot swappable arrays, and the terminal greeted us with a prompt that asked not for a password, but for a conscience. Gabriel dictated a sequence that sounded like a nursery rhyme taught by a spy, and I typed, fingers hesitating over a key that might widen history by a centimeter. The screen unfolded a ledger of debts that had never existed and absolutions that had never been earned. Each line item tethered to initials familiar from confirmation hearings. The directive wasn't surveillance. It was choreography, and the dance partners were judges and lawmakers who claimed they never learned the steps. Hart absorbed it like cold iron takes heat, and I saw sorrow before fury. Cade leaned in, selling the idea that context could explain away the stain. But a nearby camera captured his angle, and Linus' text arrived. Live satellite feed locked. If we opened the record, the country would watch with its own eyes. Gabriel warned that a purge daemon was ticking. If Cade touched anything, the system would delete itself into denial. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat deciding. The purge daemon woke like a crocodile beneath still water. No alarm, just a timestamp rolling forward, and whole folders turning to ash behind polite progress bars. Mercer moved first, pinning Cade's reaching hand with a look that quoted the oath they both knew by heart. Delgado sealed the room, radios crackling as if choosing sides. Hart asked me if we could outpace deletion. Gabriel said not by running, but by making the machine keep a promise, and he told me to invoke the federal continuity clause buried in a maintenance script. I found it. A line of text that forced redundant mirrors to spool to external nodes, a legal requirement masquerading as housekeeping. The cursor trembled over enter and then descended, and the system hiccuped into honesty, broadcasting to a public archive, as if saluting. Cade laughed softly, a sound with blades in it, and warned that the country loved outrage more than reform. Lena's alert pinged again. Feeds are live. You are now the record. Hart stepped forward, laying a palm on the cage, and said sometimes the only way out of a fire is through it. The demons' progress slowed, but the clock did not. Alarms promised company before Boots delivered it. 2 federal tactical officers whose patches were as new as their orders, insisting on immediate evacuation due to environmental hazard, which smelled exactly like the lie you tell when truth becomes airborne. Mercer's badge met theirs and held a duel of protocols that only ended when Hart invoked authority with the completeness of the office, reminding them that hazard protocols include safeguarding evidence. Delgado collected their names aloud for the camera. Cade called for deference and was given distance instead. The stream stabilized, and with it came a chorus of notifications, judges recusing themselves in a wave that looked less like ethics and more like fear. Committee chairs issuing statements braided from the same ghostwriter. Gabriel sagged as if a weight he'd trained to carry had finally found the ground. He told me the last shard was human, a witness who had built the ledger and regretted it. Hart asked where. He nodded toward the memorial above, and the idea that contrition had been carved into stone or right over our heads felt like a dare from history. We rose from the underbelly into the memorial's cavernous hush, where names etched in stone turned sound into responsibility. Rain threaded the open oculus and stitched the floor with silver. The witness waited on a bench like a penitent, a woman in her late 40s with the calm of someone who had rehearsed telling the truth and accepted the cost. When she lifted her face, Gabriel said her name with reverence and sorrow. She confessed to coding the ledger as an integrity index before it was perverted into leverage, and that she had warned Cade's office in memos that died in polished folders. Hart listened as if kneeling without moving, and asked if the directive could survive sunlight without devouring the institutions it touched. "No," the woman said, "institutions aren't porcelain. Their habits and habits change when people do." Outside, the crowd thickened. Inside, the marble held our breath. Cade approached with a sermon about stability, but his voice echoed too long, like marketing in a sanctuary. The woman opened her coat, revealing a keycard and a resignation letter, and chose the country over her clearance. The memorial's hush fractured as the stream reached living rooms and airport gates, and with it came a tide of voices that sounded like a verdict rehearsing itself. Phones rose like candles. Security lines thickened, and the thought, Marble Hall, gained a pulse. Issuer. Hart asked the engineer to repeat the origin story on record. Her tone a steadied bridge between confession and consequence, while Mercer triangulated exits that suddenly mattered. Delgado marked a perimeter with tape that meant nothing to ambition, everything to cameras, and I kept writing, the pen skating over a page that felt heavier than paper. Cade slipped into the space beside the engineer and tried to graft her regret to his narrative of stewardship, promising that the directive had saved lives and only needed adult supervision, which is how captured systems ask for one more chance. Gabriel stood very still, knowing stillness attracts gravity. He said the machine does not need supervision, it needs dismantling. The word hung. Even the rain paused in the oculus before remembering to fall. Beyond the doors, chanting rose in imperfect unison, "Tell the truth and keep it told." The engineer's testimony flowered into specifics that made the abstract bruise, and every name she spoke rearranged the calculus of rooms we could no longer enter. Hart absorbed the blows with the quiet of someone who has weathered storms and learned which ones deserve her. Cade pivoted to procedure, offering a protective review. Panel staffed by the very hands the ledger had preferred, and the offer felt like a velvet lid over a living thing. Mercer received a whisper in his earpiece and stiffened. A parallel task force was en route with warrants shaped like nets, and if they landed first, the story would be repackaged as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Delgado called for additional units, but knew the math cameras equal safety until they don't. Gabriel asked me if I trusted sunlight more than flames. I said light first, then whatever keeps the lights on. We moved. A small constellation navigating toward the exit that fed the press line, while Hart lingered just long enough to place a hand on the stone and promise, aloud or silently, that names mattered more than institutions that names forgot them. No, we broke into daylight bruised by sirens, a plaza blooming with spontaneous civics, and the air felt ionized, as if the city had been rubbed awake. Lena Cho threaded through the humanity with a steadiness more reliable than any podium, asking questions that refused to be ornamental. And when Hart stepped to the impromptu microphones, the plaza inhaled. She said the directive would be suspended pending a full declassification review to be led by people with nothing to gain and everything to owe, and that no office, including hers, would be spared scrutiny. The words had edges, and edges care, and they cut. Cade applauded while drafting his injunction with his eyes, and agents from the parallel task force arrived with postures that meant, "We are not here to listen." Mercer intercepted credentials forward, exchanging the language of thresholds. Delgado nested the engineer inside a ring of yellow raincoats. Gabriel leaned to me and named a judge who would try to stall with a midnight order. I texted Lena, who nodded like someone placing the final piece in a map. The crowd began to chant again, but softer, now less a demand than a vow. The injunction arrived as rumored. Digital parchment borne by an aide who ran like a courier from another century, and Cade flourished it as if summoning order from thin air. For a breath, the plaza wobbled between obedience and memory. Hart read the lines with the same patience she'd given to grief, then looked up and stated that extraordinary secrecy could not restrain ordinary oversight, and that the order failed to meet the standard because it relied on facts, now disproven on camera. The crowd murmured, "Precedent made human." Mercer warned that arguments don't stop handcuffs, and the task force stepped closer, not toward Hart, but toward Gabriel and the engineer, the softer targets. Delgado whistled a note that aligned uniforms in a chevron. I felt my pulse count to 10 and then keep going. Gabriel whispered that if they separated us, the backup would flood the city with raw dumps, names unredacted, chaos where clarity should live. I told him we would not trade justice for spectacle, and Hart must have heard because she nodded once, and invited the task force to accompany us to the South Lawn for a joint statement under lights that never turn off. The convoy that left the memorial looked like an argument learning to move in a straight line: government SUVs, city cruisers, media vans, and a clot of citizens who refused to let the story disappear around a corner. Streets parted in reluctant waves, traffic lights, blinking compliance, and Washington wore the face it saves for moments it hopes are rare. Inside our vehicle, Hart outlined a path that sounded like law, remembering how to walk. Temporary suspension, immediate audit, independent counsel with teeth, public access to records scrubbed only of private harm, and I watched Cade translate each clause into an obstacle he would nurture. Mercer relayed route changes designed to avoid choke points, and Delgado kept our witness talking to keep her from drowning in quiet. Gabriel rested his head back and counted, not sheep but obligations. He told me the person who engineered the kill switch had a family and a mortgage and a garden, and that justice had to leave room for a life after confession. The motorcade curved toward the South Lawn as storm clouds thinned to a pale, complicated dawn, and the city leaned in to see if we would flinch. The South Lawn received us like a stage, washed clean by stormlight, grass jeweled with rain, rotors carving the early dawn into ribbons, and every light that mattered already burning. Protocols collided with purpose at the rope line. The task force tried to funnel us toward a prefab tent where statements are softened, but Hart steered to the open lectern, to air and witnesses, and the choice crackled through, comms like a fuse being traced. Mercer's voice was a steady metronome. Grids, clearances, contingencies, while Delgado checked name tags as if identity itself were an entry pass. Cade arrived with a phalanx of counsel and a smile that announced the end of the beginning. He proposed a brief executive huddle, which sounded exactly like a room with no minutes. Gabriel tugged the cuffs and asked if the lawn counted as safe. I said only if we make it unsafe for secrets. The engineer stood closer to Hart, hand tight on her keycard, and Lena kept outside the fence by protocol. Lifted her lens anyway. Somewhere, an anthem rehearsal carried on, and I realized the country loves rituals until someone asks what they're for. Microphones woke with that electrostatic hiss that sounds like nerves clearing their throat, and the lawn became a geometry of sightlines and motives. Hart asked for a live pool feed. A producer blinked, then nodded, because momentum is a credential of its own. Kay delivered a velvet threat. National security exemptions, reputational triage, the promise of eventual transparency. Each clause a staircase descending away from daylight. Mercer countered by citing the continuity broadcast already underway, and I watched Cade compute the cost of being seen obstructing math. Delgado brought the engineer forward, and Gabriel tested the chain on his wrists against the podium. Not to break it, but to make a sound that would live in B-roll. Hart placed her notes down and didn't look at them. She told me to begin with the ledger's origin, then the mechanism, then the remedy. I breathed rain and jet fuel, and names etched on my tongue my long nights. And I realized the difference between fear and readiness is sometimes only a sentence, said aloud with both hands open. The first word never came, because the first shove did. 2 members of the task force broke pattern, angling toward Gabriel with choreography too clean to be improvised, and the lawn's order snapped like a wishbone. Mercer's draw was not for a weapon, but for a warrant. He produced authority louder than a shout, and Delgado's officers interlocked elbows with a speed that belonged to people who had practiced solidarity off-camp. Cade raised both palms, a pantomime of innocence, while an aide slipped south toward a service path where vans waited with engines thinking and idle. Hart stepped between Gabriel and the intrusion with the gravity of title and choice, and for a moment even the helicopters respected the pause. I told the nearest mic that any attempt to remove a witness from a live evidentiary proceeding would constitute obstruction. The sentence landed like a line, finally reaching its period. Lena captured the pivot. The engineer whispered that the kill switch's author was on the grounds right now, summoned by Cade's office. Gabriel closed his eyes and said, "It's time we ask your question with the volume turned up." Cade pivoted to language, the subtler weapon, unfurling a provisional gag order, purportedly faxed by a judge whose name would soon be a headline, claiming immediate harm from continued disclosure. It was a paper shield with edges sharp enough to cut anyone holding it wrong. Hart read, exhaled, and answered on mic that emergency secrecy invoked to prevent embarrassment is not law but costume. She invited the judge to join the feed and defend the order in daylight. The crowd beyond the fence cheered with a kind of careful joy. Mercer radioed that the service path was now sealed. Delgado announced badge checks every 10 feet. The engineer leaned into the mic and spoke the first file path, her voice small at first and then exact, and the screens on the press riser bloomed with indices that wore no euphemism. I framed the remedy independent counsel by statute, full declassification with targeted redaction for private harm, and a moratorium on any use of the directive pending criminal review. Gabriel nodded once, as if the word remedy were a bridge he finally trusted to step on. The judge declined to join the feed, which was its own testimony, and an odd quiet fell, like the moment just before the choir decides to sing. Hart took it, filling the space with a pledge that sounded like the Republic reminding itself of its spine and independent counsel, named by bipartisan statute. A published audit trail, whistleblower protections with retroactive teeth, and immediate suspension of the directive pending a criminal probe. She gestured to me. I read the legal framing. The words tasted like metal and mercy. Katie tried one last time to recast the night as housekeeping gone noisy, but the lawn had learned the tune and wouldn't hum along. Lena captured the faces, fear, relief, defiance, and somewhere in the grid of windows across the river, lights flicked on in offices where damage control dresses as conscience. Gabriel asked if there was a plan for him beyond the podium. Mercer answered, yes. and the yes sounded like a door opening to a smaller, ordinary life. The engineer slipped her resignation letter into Hart's hand. The rotors stilled. The lawn exhaled. We were not done, but we had finally begun. Dawn cracked into briefing rooms where coffee steamed like surrender, and the night's courage began its negotiation with the day's consequences. That's when the counterpunch arrived, paper-clipped and smiling. Cade's office filed for emergency relief with a judge 2 circuits over, alleging irreparable harm to intelligence equities, a phrase that always means embarrassment wearing armor. Hart convened us in a West Wing conference room that smelled of lemon polish and old decisions. She asked what we could defend in court and what we must defend in public, and the difference felt like picking which lung to keep. Mercer reported a breach attempt on the continuity feed, internal credentials, recent issue, while Delgado flagged a suspicious van idling near the ellipse. The engineer traced the credential to a contractor on Cade's donor roll. Gabriel stared at the seal on the carpet, as if it might open and swallow the complicity beneath. I said we needed a judge who remembered the oath comes before the optics. Hart nodded, then surprised us all. We'd take it to the press room and the courtroom together, and we bring the witness who wrote the code and the lawyer who won't let it be translated into wallpaper. The press room breathed like a living animal, lights blinking, tripods bristling, and I felt the old fear laced with a new discipline. Words would either carve a path or cut our feet. Hart opened with jurisdiction, a narrow promise to fight in daylight, then yielded to me for the anatomy of the ledger. I described debts that never were, absolutions that bought votes, and a directive that had mistaken necessity for permission. The engineer followed, confessing architecture without absolving weaponization. Questions flew like coin sources, chain of custody, risk to operations. Gabriel leaned toward a mic and said the risk was pretending. The ledger didn't exist. Cade arrived, flanked by counsel, all ease, announcing that a judge had granted a temporary stay on further dissemination, which he translated as silence with paperwork. Hart thanked him and stated we would honor lawful orders while seeking immediate review, then pivoted to announce protective status for the engineer and Gabriel. The room shifted. Less theater, more trial. And in that hinge I saw it one of the task force agents at the back, the one who'd lunged on the lawn, tapping a message into a phone with a serpent-quiet thumb. Security pulled the agent before the question could finish its mark, but his phone kept talking, messages flowering in threads named with innocuous nouns. Picnic, errands, lawn. Each one a map toward an extraction at a service. Entrance. Entry not free. Entrance is tour. Mercer moved us sideways through the building's veins, framed photos of handshakes flickering past like reminders of promises that outlived their authors. Delgado coordinated with park police to box the van. The driver wore a contractor badge so fresh, the ink looked tacky. In a service corridor that smelled of copier heat, the engineer recognized a name in the thread. The colleague who had built the kill switch, and then begged her to leave it dormant. Hart paused, then made the call that separates management from leadership. Bring him in. Not in cuffs, in conscience. Cade objected with a 3-part harmony of liability, optics, and chain of command. Hart reminded him that justice, not theater, was our audience. Gabriel squeezed his eyes shut, as if listening for footsteps. I drafted a protective proffer on a rolling cart, while the building remembered to be a citadel and a home at once. They brought him through a staff entrance used for deliveries and quiet departures, late 30s, pale from fluorescent devotion. Tie crooked with the human cost of secrets. When he saw the engineer, something unclenched and broke. He admitted writing the daemon under directive, lured by a promise that it would guard against leaks, then watched it become a guillotine aimed upward. Cade's deputies, he said, had asked for resilience, which translated to plausible deniability. Plausible deniability. Hart offered the proffer, voice steady as a rail. He signed with hands that shook, then pointed us to a shadow ledger. Metadata that proved intentional manipulation by senior staff. The clock turned carnivorous. The stay hearing was set for an hour from now, with a judge known for loving procedure like poetry. I argued we needed to walk in with the shadow ledger and a living author. Cade warned the evidence was fruit from a poisoned tree. The author looked at me and said, "I was the soil, not the fruit." Gabriel, softer than before, told him that telling the truth would not unmake what he'd done, but it might stop others from perfecting it. Court felt like weather. Oak and echo, and the pressure changed before lightning when we stepped into the emergency hearing, the seal looming like a warning disguised as pride. The judge peered over glasses with the patience of a librarian who has seen every excuse. Cade sang standing, weaving privacy and peril into a rope he hoped would pull the record shut. I rose with a page that weighed like a door. The continuity broadcast was lawful, the harms speculative, the ledger's existence indisputable, and the remedy independent counsel and targeted redaction. An act of civic hygiene, not act of civic hygiene. Vandalism. The engineer testified first, then the author, voice thin but true. Mercer's affidavit laid out the attempted extraction. Delgado's chain of custody held. Cade tried to discredit motive and moment. Hart, seated behind us, did not speak, but the room felt her vow like a second oath. The judge recessed for 10 minutes that lasted a year, then returned with a ruling that split hairs and still bled. The stay was narrowed to protect active operations only. The broadcast could continue with redactions overseen by the court, and whistleblowers were placed under the court's wing. Outside, the sky finally chose blue. By afternoon, the city moved like someone learning to breathe again, cautious and amazed. And the broadcast became a river that no one person could dam. What changed wasn't volume but direction. The current, running from Marble to kitchens and bus stops and school pickup lines, where justice is a word children hear through grown-up mouths. Hart signed the executive actions with a pen that felt heavier than ink, ordering the suspension and the audit that would have teeth, while the court's order traveled beside it like a guardrail made of sentences. Cade retreated into statements that sounded like umbrellas held over rain that had already fallen, promising cooperation, demanding limits, measuring which way the wind remembered. Gabriel watched from a side room with an unremarkable chair and a window that overlooked ordinary trees. He asked me if ordinary was possible now. I told him ordinary is just what truth looks like when it's allowed to stay. The engineer sat with a cup that steamed into her glasses and said she would testify again and again and again until the habit of secrecy forgot her name. Evenings always ask the bill, and this one itemized our courage agents reassigned. Committees convened under lights that finally felt like tools, not theater, and a stream of affidavits that read like people remembering who they were meant to be. Lena's story threaded the ledger's birth to its abuse without sharpening it into a weapon against bystanders, and the comment lines filled not with algorithms but with neighbors. The chant from the memorial softened into porch talk in PTA meetings, which is how laws become culture or fade. Hart called me to the Roosevelt room and asked, in the quiet that follows fire, what remedy should look like tomorrow. I said protection with back pay for those who told the truth, indictments where proof bites hard, and a habit of publishing the rules before they're used. Gabriel asked if he would always be the headline. I told him in honest country files its heroes under people and lets them live there. The engineer scrolled through code she had brought into the light and deleted a line that once felt like insurance. She called it gardening. Outside, the flag remembered how to move in a normal wind. The indictments didn't drop like thunder. They arrived like careful rain, names spaced by diligence and corroboration, and each summons read as a small refusal to forget. Cade stepped to a lectern bearing a seal that suddenly looked too large for him, and resigned with a speech about service and misunderstanding. The room did not applaud, it noted. The judge with the midnight orders recused herself before the headline asked. The donor contractor smiled for a mugshot and then asked for counsel. The task force's rogue pair were walked out the front door in bright day. Not as sad spectacle, but as record. Hart visited a federal cemetery with no cameras in tow. Even so, the quiet got out, and it mattered. Gabriel, no longer cuffed, walked the south lawn as a guest, the grass startlingly soft under shoes that had learned institutional floors. He asked what comes next when a machine believes it's invisible and then finds out it isn't. I said machines don't believe. People do. The engineer laughed for the first time all day, small and real, and said belief can be debugged if you keep the logs. Night returned with fewer sirens and more conversations, and I took Gabriel to a diner that served coffee without pretense and pie with an opinion. The waitress didn't recognize us, which felt like a benediction. He said he might leave the city for a while, maybe teach somewhere that still believes syllabi are contracts with the future. I told him disappearing is different from resting, and he deserved the latter. Lena slid into the booth with a grin that had fought for the right to exist and asked if the story had an ending. I said stories like this only get episodes and responsibilities. Delgado texted a photo of her officers laughing in a locker room that used to hold more dread than jokes. Mercer sent a single check mark and the word home. The engineer emailed lines of code that replaced the demon with a transparency log. Too poetic for a repository. Perfect for the moment. Outside, the city glowed less like a fortress and more like a neighborhood. And I realized justice isn't a finale but a maintenance schedule, written in public and signed over and over by people who promise to show up. Before morning claimed the sky, we returned to where the night had decided to matter, the precinct that smelled of wet paper and effort. The payphone still bolted to its chipped green wall, like a relic that had learned prophecy. Delgado signed the last line on a custody form, and then tore a carbon sheet free with a flourish fit for theater. Mercer leaned in the doorway looking 10 years older and 5 pounds lighter, which is to say, human. Hart's motorcade hummed by en route to a day of meetings that would feel like sweeping glass into orderly piles. She texted one sentence that didn't read like a president and therefore did keep me honest. Gabriel lifted the receiver, not to call anyone, but to listen to the dial tone that had started this avalanche. He set it down and smiled the way people do when they've met the worst of themselves and carried it out into light. I walked into the rain and let it beat on my face, the city unspooling to an ordinary Saturday that would carry extraordinary chores, audits, arraignments, apologies, reforms. Justice isn't a landing, it's a runway, and today we learned how to taxi without lying.